Sakai's impossible escape. The miraculous flight of a legend. One pilot, one bullet, and a 600-mile flight for survival. Discover how Saburo Sakai's impossible escape revealed the fatal flaw that would eventually ground the entire Japanese Imperial Air Force.
Saburo Sakai climbed high to gain a decisive height advantage. He prepared to dive on what he thought were wildcats. As he closed the distance, he realized his fatal mistake. The aircraft were actually SBD Dauntless dive bombers in formation. Each bomber carried a rear gunner with twin machine guns. These weapons were specifically designed to fend off attacking fighters. Sakai had flown directly into a deadly and trapped position. The American gunners opened fire on the lone Zero simultaneously. A storm of bullets tore into Sakai's thin cockpit glass. Metal struck metal as rounds shattered the pilot's protective canopy. One bullet struck Sakai in the head, destroying his goggles. It creased his skull and exited through his bloody forehead. The impact blinded him instantly in his right eye today. Blood poured into his left eye, obscuring his remaining vision. Half his body went numb as his nerves suffered damage. His Zero rolled into a steep dive toward the ocean. The pain was indescribable, like an axe splitting his head. He could barely think through the waves of deep agony. The altimeter unwound rapidly as the plane plummeted toward water. By any reasonable measure, Saburo Sakai should have surely died. He was hundreds of miles from his base at Rabaul. He was surrounded by enemies in a very damaged aircraft. Most pilots would have lost consciousness and crashed their plane. But Sakai did not give up on his own life. Fighting through disorientation, he regained control of his nimble fighter. His right hand still worked and he felt the stick. He arrested the dive just above the cresting ocean waves. He began the longest flight of his legendary combat life. For nearly 5 hours, he flew across the open sea. He bit his lip and slapped himself to stay awake. Occasionally, his vision cleared enough to see his flight instruments. He fought the urge to give up and just die. Stubbornness and training kept him in the air that day. When he reached Rabaul, he nearly crashed into parked planes. He landed on his second attempt with an empty tank. Ground crews were horrified by the state of his cockpit. Sakai refused treatment until he gave his formal mission report. He stood at attention despite his catastrophic and bloody wounds. This injury ended his frontline career for nearly 2 years. The bullet permanently destroyed the vision in his right eye. Before evacuation, Sakai reflected on the tenacity of his enemies. The Americans had not broken or run from the fight. They fought with a skill that Japanese propaganda called impossible. The air battles over Guadalcanal forced a very painful recalibration. Japanese pilots had to rethink how they viewed their enemy. The Marines at Henderson Field were not all elite pilots. Many arrived with minimal experience in actual aerial combat missions. Their Wildcats were technically inferior to the legendary Japanese Zero. The Zero was faster and much more maneuverable in turns. On paper, every engagement should have been a Japanese victory. However, aircraft specifications did not tell the entire war story. American planes were ruggedly built to survive heavy combat damage. A Wildcat could absorb dozens of hits and keep flying. Pilots sat behind heavy armor plating that stopped enemy bullets. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented the planes from catching fire easily. Japanese designers sacrificed protection for speed and high maneuverability. This made the Zero light but also very fatally vulnerable. A single burst of .50 caliber fire could destroy it. The American tactical system was also evolving very rapidly then. Surviving pilots learned hard lessons and applied them immediately after. Intelligence officers debriefed every pilot to find what worked well. Successful tactics were spread across the entire American Air Force. New rules were developed for engaging the dangerous Zero fighters. Americans learned never to dogfight a Zero at low speeds. They used altitude advantages to dive and then climb away. They fought in pairs, always protecting their assigned wingmen today. The Japanese system focused on individual glory over group learning. Ace pilots were celebrated as heroes in national news media. However, their elite techniques often died with them in battle. There was no systematic effort to capture their tactical innovations. Veteran pilots were kept in combat until they were killed. They were not sent home to train the new replacements. The consequences became clear in the rising attrition statistics soon. Japan lost 36 aircraft in the first 2 days alone. The American loss ratio held steady through months of fighting. Japanese pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. By late 1942, Japanese veterans expressed serious concerns. The Americans were not the cowards that propaganda had promised. They improved constantly and learned from every single deadly encounter. No matter how many were shot down, more appeared daily. The American supply of planes and pilots seemed totally inexhaustible. Japan was losing a brutal war of attrition in the air. The transformation accelerated with the introduction of new fighter planes. In 1943, the Grumman Hellcat appeared over the Pacific. It was big, heavy, armored, and incredibly fast in flight. Japanese pilots called the new Hellcat a very rude awakening. It could dive away from any engagement the Zero started. The 6 machine guns could tear a Zero apart quickly. Most importantly, the Hellcat was very easy for rookies to fly. The Americans could train new pilots with great speed now. The Hellcat ensured that these new pilots survived to learn. The Zero required years of training to master its flight. The Hellcat only demanded months of training for new pilots. The F4U Corsair also arrived to overmatch the Japanese planes. Kill ratios reached levels that were unthinkable a year before. Engagements became one-sided American victories during the year 1943. Japanese veterans noticed that their old tactics no longer worked. The Americans refused to enter turning fights with the Zero. They used high-speed passes and then dove away from danger. They fought as disciplined teams, never allowing themselves isolation today. Sakai returned to duty in 1944 to a different war. He saw inexperienced kids being sent to certain death daily. Putting a novice against a Hellcat was a suicidal tactic. Japanese command reached a truly brutal and dark calculus then. They could no longer win conventional air battles against America. The only remaining option was to trade lives for ships. This led to the rise of the desperate kamikaze attacks. The pilot shortage was a fundamental failure of Japanese strategy. Japan started the war with 6,000 well-trained pilots. Only 900 were considered true experts in aerial combat. This force was built for a very short, decisive conflict. Planners expected America to negotiate after suffering early major defeats. When America responded with determination, the strategy completely collapsed. The problem was structural within the Japanese aviation training system. It was designed to produce an elite but small force. The rigorous selection process eliminated almost all of the candidates. This left no room for the massive losses of attrition. As veterans died, the quality of the force dropped sharply. America, meanwhile, built a massive industrial training machine for pilots. They valued survival and technology over the cult of personality. The ruggedness of their planes saved their most precious resource. That resource was the experienced pilot who could teach others. Japan's failure to adapt led to its ultimate defeat upstairs. The story of Saburo Sakai is a rare survival tale. Most of his peers did not live to see 1945. They were victims of a system that valued the sword. The Americans won by valuing the shield and the school. This contrast defined the outcome of the entire Pacific War.